What's next for the dollar index? Hi, it's Charlie giving you Saturday's weekend video. So in this video, we're going to have a little bit of a look at the dollar itself, the dollar index, and some other markets in order to come up with some ideas in relation to where the dollar could be heading over the next few months. So right now, as we can see just this week, this is just the daily chart of the of the dollar index. The dollar index is on the climb, and you wouldn't want to bet against right now if you're just looking at this price action alone. The dollar pushing back up to these highs of April. Now, if we come to the weekly chart, again, on the weekly chart, it's all looking quite reasonable here as far as the upside is concerned. So this is all looking fine. If we come out to the monthly chart, if I zoom in slightly here, and if you just look at these three bars alone, considering I'm recording this on Saturday, the 22nd of June, if the dollar index was, by the end of this month, which is not many traded days left, if this current bar was to come up to pretty much the highs of last month, that would give us what we call a stick sandwich pattern in candlestick analysis. So big green bar, equal size down bar, followed by an equal size green bar, which would be bullish as well, if that was to happen. So look out for that by the time you get to the end of this month. So overall, the dollar index is looking quite bullish here, even out to the monthly. If we take it out to the quarterly, we really get to see what's been going on here. Again, without anything else, all I've got in is a 50 period moving average, which is my black lines here, and the 200 period moving average. So this is on the quarterly chart. So again, it just shows us that what's the overall movement like? Well, on the dollar index, we've had this run into, what was it, late 2022. We've pulled back off of that into this price zone here, and we're chopping around. When you think this is a quarterly chart, overall the dollar index has been up and down and chopping around, but it's still holding this general zone here. So there's an argument for the dollar index certainly to push higher. Okay. Now, the one thing when people look at the dollar index and make all their analysis off the dollar index is you have to appreciate you're looking at an index, the dollar against a basket of currencies. So within that basket, we have the euro, the pound, the Japanese yen, etc., etc. And we all know that the euro is roughly 60%, might be just under 60% of the total of that basket against the dollar. So the euro accounts for a lot, followed by the Japanese yen, which I think is usually sits around about 17%. So one thing to bear in mind right now is that part of this up move, if I go back to the daily chart, that's an hourly chart, the daily chart here, is because of the extreme weakness that we're seeing in the Japanese yen. So I've now brought up the dollar against the yen. And this is more about Japanese yen weakness rather than outright, super duper dollar strength. And so coming back to what I've just said, the problem that that traders need to be careful of when they're looking at the dollar index is you have to look at the component pairs as well. So you can't just make an analysis just based on the dollar index, because it can be skewed by an individual pair or two. So we really need to see, well, what's the picture going on elsewhere? So for now, as far as I'm concerned, the dollar yen is beating its own drum. We've got extreme weakness in the yen, and so that is going to help contribute towards the dollar index itself, because it is a reasonable, it's roughly 17% of that basket of currencies against the dollar. It's a reasonable amount, so it's going to help the dollar index to an extent there. Now, if we come to the euro dollar, now we all know what happened just a couple of weeks ago. We had these European-wide elections, and then Macron on the back of those decided to call for an election in France 3 years early. and that spooked the markets. The euro gap down. Okay, it then retraced, but now it's sort of languishing overall down here, and so we've got this uncertainty in the lead up to these French elections, which are coming at the end of this month. And the initial elections, then the top two parties then go head to head, so to speak, on I think it's into the 7th of July. So basically over the next 2 to 3 weeks, we've got a bit more uncertainty in relation to the euro on the back of those French elections. So what about beyond that? So this is what we're talking about here. So when you're trying to assess a market, you're trying to take in a lot of pieces of information. And so, yes, we can just take a snapshot of looking at the dollar index, but like I've said, we have to then look at some of the currencies against the dollar individually as well, and in trying to put it all together. So let's do a little bit of that now. So I'm going to come back to the euro and these other currencies, but first of all, I'm going to go back to that dollar index. And I'm going to take us back to that quarterly chart. And now I'm going to put on some trend lines that I've already prepared earlier, much like a cookery program where we say, and here's one that's already freshly come out of the oven. So what we can now see here is that the dollar index is in a lovely channel, rising channel, over these past several years, or however long, since the lows really of 2008. So does that change what we've just said about the price action? Well, one thing that we can see is that we came up to the upper channel line here when the dollar index peaked in October of 22, and so far it's been subdued. One thing that I would also note is that there overall is a divergence. This is why I've left this MACD indicator on here, because there's an overall divergence on this big time frame quarterly chart here. So that's that's lingering in the background. It doesn't have to, like anything, doesn't have to materialize. Certainly it's materialized so far. We've seen it peak and come off, and since, well, we're approaching 2 years since that peak, the dollar index is comfortably off from there. So we're waiting to find out whether this divergence is going to continue, and that ultimately the dollar index pulls back to perhaps this quarterly, the 50 period moving average here, the black line on this quarterly time frame. So are we going to see that, or are we, from a price action perspective, still going to see the dollar going higher? Okay, so these are the questions that we need to try and ascertain some form of answer to. Remember, as traders, what our job is to put risk on, is to put trades on. What is to have a view, have a conviction behind your analysis, and then you trade that analysis. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong, because if you take 100 trades, over that 100 trades, a given number of them are going to be wrong and right anyway. But the main point is that you have a conviction behind your view. So I'm just here today to facilitate, both sides of the picture, to say, well, look, overall, yeah, in the big picture here, there's certainly a case that the dollar index has pulled back and is in the early throes of a breakout. When we come back to maybe that monthly chart there, are we about to break out to the upside? And when you look at what's going on in Europe and all the uncertainty there, then there's certainly growing uncertainty there. Could that affect the euro, which then certainly we could see the dollar index breaking out? So there's certainly an argument there. But let's look at the counter argument. So if we now come back to some of these other individual currencies, and I'm going to start off with maybe the Aussie against the dollar here. Now, bearing in mind, this is now just down to a weekly chart for now. Bearing in mind, most of these currencies against the dollar, overall, if one is appreciating against the dollar, then overall, it's more likely that most of the others, the pound dollar, the euro dollar, the New Zealand dollar, are going to be appreciating against the US dollar as well, and vice versa. So overall, at the moment, we can see that the Aussie dollar is in a nice overall triangle pattern, as we can see. It's beautiful pattern here overall, and it's winding itself up within this. So again, the question is, well, are we going to break to the downside, or are we going to break to the upside? So, and I'm not even going to have chance to talk about the fundamentals here today, because I see I'm already 10 minutes into this video. One thing that I've been talking in my community about, and obviously I'm not going to go through all of my analysis that I talk to the traders in my trading room about, is see the 50 week moving average. This Aussie dollar just keeps on coming up to testing it all the way through here. Sometimes it's breaking through a bit, like here, but then coming back again and testing it through here, and then at the moment it's broken out again. So for me, looking at this overall, this looks like the Aussie dollar looks like it's got upside potential here. Now, of course, it's got, if I now zoom back in a little bit on this weekly time frame, you can see that it's actually been chopping around and consolidating for the last several weeks. It's not actually doing anything. And if I put this to the daily chart, you can see quite clearly what's going on there. So it's gone a bit boring in that regard, but that's what markets do. So for now, the Aussie dollar looks promising to the upside against the US dollar. Let's have a look at the New Zealand, because New Zealand is very similar. So I'll just take us out to a monthly chart. So again, you can see some trend line analysis here. There's a big longer term channel, as you can see here, going way back to the early 2000s. And of course, I've got this declining trend line across the tops, which is also creating a bit of a mini triangle down here as well. So if I now take this to the weeklies, similar pattern to that of the Aussie, keeps on testing this 50 week. We're back above it, and very similar to the Aussie there, consolidating here overall. Not nice price action. If you zoom in a bit here, you can see it's just rubbish really, and then you look at the overall price action here on the daily chart. So individually not great price action, but it's consolidating. So the prospect, the potential for an upside break in both of those is there against the US dollar. If we now go to cable, the pound dollar. So for cable, funny enough, yet again, we've got a long-term trend line going all the way back. I'd need to take this onto a monthly chart so you can see that's taken us all the way back to the highs of 2008, this long-term trend line. But there's also this trend line since the sort of March 23, takes us back to the weekly chart. The March 2023 lows here coming underneath. So again, the pound has been winding itself within this sort of mini triangle pattern on the weekly chart, and it's trying to break out. Now, just in this past week or so, we can see that the pound has backed off. Okay, but does that materially change the overall price action at this stage? Not really, because what I'm looking at is not, what I'm doing here today is not what is going to happen tomorrow or the day after or the week after. I'm looking at the bigger picture, as I said at the beginning, over the next few months. So the scope, the potential for the pound having made that major low in the autumn of 2022, it's bounced off of that low. This looks to me like a false break to the downside so far at least, and then we've broken up, and could we break up further and then move into the 133s? Of course, the UK has a pending election as well, so it's not quite the uncertainty situation that we're, because it's pretty much the market knows who's about to get into power, Labour, so that's pretty much a done deal. So the market's not too bothered about that. So are we about to see the pound break to the upside? So I mean, don't get me wrong, that we could just completely roll over, but these are the three currency pairs I've just shown. A building for a potential upside breakout, not downside. Now, if things roll over, okay, then we could change that view. If the pound rolls all the way back down to the lower part of this lower trend line, and we get a trend line breakdown there, okay, all bets are off, and then there's plenty of scope to the downside. But right now, the pound, the Aussie, the Kiwi are still in the position to be in this overall breakout to the upside. And if I then go to the euro, the biggest constituent part, well, again, similar as the pound, we've got this trend line on the weekly chart, and another trend line across here. So, and a trend line going a little bit further back as well. So again, the euro is in a triangle pattern overall here. Now, interestingly, the euro is that bit weaker at the moment because of what's happening there in France with the uncertainty of the French elections and an extreme right party getting into power, and just a little bit of uncertainty around that. So we'll have to see what happens again over in 3 weeks' time. Let's see how whether the markets settle down depending on what goes on. So we've got some fascinating charts going on. We've got the Aussie, the euro, the Aussie, the New Zealand dollar, the pound dollar, all looking reasonable for still more upside in the medium term. The euro admittedly looks a bit weaker over the last couple of weeks here because of the political uncertainty there. But if the euro holds this overall pattern, and then we start to see some positive weeks coming in, then I wouldn't write off the euro breaking back up here. So in summary, bringing it all back to the dollar index, at first glance, and if you just look at the dollar index, you'd say up to the upside, and it may well do, but you've got to put it all into context with what's going on elsewhere, which means that although in the near term the dollar index has got a bit of momentum, price momentum behind it, but there are some question marks over that medium term as to whether the dollar index actually ends up rolling over again. So that's how I'm looking at it. I think that it's a fascinating story developing across multiple currency pairs. The question is, are we about to see a rip higher in the dollar, and actually those currencies roll over? Or is this just more noise before the dollar rolls over and we start seeing leadership there, breakouts in the Aussie against the US dollar and the New Zealand against the US dollar as well, and then by proxy the pound, and then bringing up the rear most likely the euro. So does that give us a conclusion? I think the conclusion, as always, is you make your own conclusion. I have mine, and I take all of this sort of analysis in, and then I form a plan of attack around that analysis. So if I was more of a dollar bull, and if you're more of a dollar bull, then you can start to put a plan of attack around that, and and say, well, okay, this is the next major resistance that it's probably going to work its way towards. If you're more of a dollar bear, then you might be sort of a bit more cautious towards that and just waiting to see whether this just exhausts itself and then starts rolling over, and then you do something on the back of that. So there's some food for thought today. Don't just look at an index like the dollar index by itself. You have to look at some of the component parts. I haven't even looked at the likes of dollar Swiss, because again, that one beats its own drum a bit like the dollar yen. But it's so important to look at some of these major currency pairs rather than just looking at the index alone. I hope that is of some use to you. A longer video here today. As always, give us a like and a thumbs up, and do follow if you don't already do, in order to support the channel.